Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today I'm joined by Hans Lander, one of the hosts of the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. Hans, welcome to the program.
I am very honored to be here, Scott. Thank you for having me on.
You're now a respected member of society. Thanks for coming on. I mean, it's a high honor to come on this podcast. Not everybody gets an invite. You know, you've got to really work hard to get on here. But thanks for coming on. We've got a lot to talk about today. First up, let's talk about police, because that's what everybody wants to talk about. President Trump is trying to turn defund the police into a campaign issue. The problem is that most Democrat leaders don't go that far, and many Republicans agree with the left's proposed police reforms. Prominent conservatives want an end to qualified immunity, which protects officers from a lot of litigation and allows them to do their job. And also, a lot of these conservatives and Republicans want to neuter police unions because unions are bad. Meanwhile, cops all across the country are pulling back from riot-riddled cities. Hans, how do you think the police issue will play out? Will we see a Blue Lives Matter backlash eventually?
I think you're already starting to see it on some level. Yesterday, Trump gave that speech in the Rose Garden. It was totally bizarre. Like he basically gave up halfway through.
Low black unemployment. Yeah, we've had so many opportunities. They love it. HBCUs, we've done so much for them.
Well, then he started talking about Corona, and he's like, we never saw it coming, and it's from China. I'm just like, bro, this is awesome, because I think we all feared, oh God, he's gonna do the whole systemic bias and policing.
Yeah, there was to backtrack just a little bit. There was a report from this awful race hustler lawyer, S. Lee Merritt, saying that S. Lee Merritt was going to give a speech. And Merritt, of course, is the lawyer for the George Floyd family, and he's been involved in a host of racial issues and a lot of false allegations of racism against the police. Anyway, he was supposed to speak there, and he's like, yeah, Trump's advisor, Jaron Smith, Jaron are very, very typical Trump advisor name, Jaron, was telling him that they're going to have systemic racism included in the executive order and everything like that. Eventually, none of that happened. I'm not even quite sure if Merritt was at the Rose Garden speech. He certainly didn't give a talk, and I believe Trump did meet with the families, and I think that's where S. Lee Merritt was in attendance, because he did meet with Ahmaud Arbery's family and the Floyd family, and I assume their lawyers were along with them. Both are lawyers. Both sides hired race hustler lawyers.
Was he asking them for construction tips? I don't really know what he was.
They're asking it's like, I love to check out construction. No, Trump is a real estate developer. Of course, he would love to hear about Ahmaud Arbery's amateur construction skills. So yeah, they were talking about this, and Trump. They did release, they were hyping this terrible statement from Ahmaud Arbery's mother saying oh, Trump listened to me so much and everything. But the general gist of that speech was it was so stupid that no one would take it serious. It reminded me a lot of how Trump's speech on the jobs report. This is I think 2 weeks ago, and he's talking about the jobs report. He's like, George Floyd is looking down from heaven, and he is so proud of the jobs report. He's just looking down from heaven. He just can't believe it. I mean, it just becomes so comical that no one takes it seriously. And I mean, yes, it's stupid. We don't want him to say this, but it does undermine any cucked message he wants to deliver.
Yeah, and so in the speech yesterday, he basically gave up halfway through, and I was watching it in the background while working, and I kept looking over, and I kept waiting to see some black activist take the podium from him, and then it didn't happen. And then out of nowhere, he invites a bunch of sheriffs and I'm assuming PD union officials up, and gives them medals or whatever. I'm like, okay, so we went from racism in police to speech that doesn't matter to hey, the cops are awesome. Maybe the ploy here is we're going to get the police unions on our side for the next election. I don't know.
I think the police unions are already on the side. Yeah. I mean, police unions are just getting more base. They were the big union in New York City like retweeted Jeff Sessions defending Confederate monuments. So we're like, yes, we salute. And I keep tweeting this out. It's like police unions are literally the only good institution in our country, and conservatives are so stupid that they want to like dismantle them. I'm like, these are like they're the only ones that like support right-wing policies. They're like post like people want to always like valorize the military, and yes, we respect military service and everything like that. We're not going that far, but the military is like so paused and so cucked and delivers like Black Lives Matter messaging, especially in recent weeks. They've been just going all on board with the riots. Meanwhile, like police unions are sharing like color of crime statistics and like being like, we need to teach these punks a lesson. And it's like Black youths going crazy. And so they're like the different messaging. If you got rid of police unions, they would, I think I've said this a couple times before, you would just get British police, which are terrible. They're just like these fat pears who don't do shit towards real criminals. If there's somebody, as we were seeing like with the Brits, British soccer hooligans trying to defend their statues, they get in full riot gear and stuff, and they're like try to fight them and stuff. But if it's like Black Lives Matter, they're just letting their asses get beat. And like we saw so many images of just like the protesters like making them kneel and then punching them in the face. And that's like what you would have with America. I mean, we're having a little bit of with America, but American police, due to qualified immunity and the power of police unions, are allowed to do their jobs. And without those measures, we would have more lawlessness. You'd also ruin an institution, like the one institution that's mostly on our side. Yes, there are several problems. Police are assholes. That's a part of their job. You don't necessarily want to turn them into unqualified, heroes that we can't even criticize. But police unions are good. That's the fact of the matter.
I don't know. Like what, if you never really hear from these people, like at what point do you think the police were good? I mean, even if you look at policing around the turn of the 20th century in the big cities, I mean, first of all, it was mostly comprised of pretty much the same people it's comprised of now, like, a lot of Irish and Polish and Italian people. And they beat the shit out of you. Like if you cause problems, they would 100% beat the shit out of you, or they would just kill you. And I don't know at what point these people idolize some like model of perfect policing. It certainly has never existed in big American cities. Big American cities have always sucked.
Yeah, I think they just look to the UK. I mean, UK police don't have firearms. There's like a ton of women. They're focused on Facebook posts, not like knife crime. They can't do anything if there's actually a serious criminal threat. I mean, they really just want like glorified social workers as police.
And there's whole sections of London, of Tower Hamlets, of multiple cities, certain ones that were kind of indicted in the Rotherham scandals, but where my understanding is that the cops just don't venture into. There is basically zero police presence in huge swaths of large British cities, primarily because they just don't have the ability to handle a situation if it goes south. Like they can't use their firearms. They can't actually get tough with anyone. They basically have to go back to base, get armored up, actually get weapons, and then come back if they want to deal with something. They can't go in and just deal with a situation.
Yeah, we're probably going to see that. I mean, the Chaz situation in Seattle is indicative of this, is that we could have this all throughout America where they're pulling back. I mean, they've pulled back a lot in Baltimore, and Baltimore's, after the 2015 riots, and the murder rate skyrocketed. And so we're going to see that. And so, I mean, Minneapolis, they're just defunding the police entirely. So we're going to see this all over the place where police are just pulling back from many neighborhoods. They don't want to get involved in these situations, and they're just worried about even responding to hostile situations. As we're seeing in the in Atlanta, with the Atlanta, they burned down a Wendy's after I only get these people's like first name because like the last name is like something really generic Anglo, but Rayshard, I think Travis, I forget. Like I can't even remember. I think it's like either Travis or Brooks. Sorry for the folks are probably gonna be mad about this, but we'll just call him Rayshard. Rayshard, the drunk driver who fell asleep in the middle of the Wendy's drive-through, police officers were fully warranted to shoot this guy because he was not complying. Everyone agrees that DUI drivers need to be arrested. And there was like all these black reporters like, why didn't they call him an Uber home? I'm like, when have police ever called an Uber home for a drunk driver who's like, it's like if you pass out in the middle of the like interstate and like people are like behind you, they're not going to come over. It's like, hey man, are you okay? He's like, oh, I'm just trying to sleep it off in the middle of the highway. They're not going to like say like, okay, here, you need to get an Uber home. Like this guy was not in a parking spot or, on the side of the road. He was in the middle of he was in the middle of a drive-through, and when he woke up, he would definitely go driving again. Like he only passed out because of, he lost control. And then he attacked the officers. He stole their taser, and he was possibly running to his car to get a weapon, and they shot him. End of story. But now the main officer who shot him is fired. Both the officers involved are suspended, and they're demanding immediate police changes, and there might even be murder charges pressed against these officers, even though every law enforcement expert has said that this was 100% justified. So there is like a situation where, if police do any part of their job against a person of color, they risk losing, they certainly risk losing their career and potentially going to jail for life if they upset POC.
Well, yeah, then, let's say the police have been pulled back, and this is in Atlanta. What is the Wendy's staff supposed to do? If a guy like
social worker,
like the guy literally passes out with his running vehicle in your drive-through, what do you?
It's disrupting your business. Like all those people can't get
exactly.
It's disrupting your business. There's nothing you could do. I guess they could have knocked on the window, and be like, "Hey, man, you're still there." But that guy's still a threat because if you wake him up, then he's gonna drive home.
40,000 something Americans died of car accidents last year, and several 100,000 were seriously injured, and some percentage of that, some large percentage of that is 100% DUI. So it stands to reason, like even if you wake the guy up and you just say, hey, yo, go home, there's a probably good chance he gets on the highway, gets on the interstate and fucking kills somebody. And so on some level, I'm like, if you pull back the cops, if you pull back the highway patrol, state troopers, whatever, like, what does your DUI fatality rate look like? Does it double? Does it triple? Do people just get lit every time before they go driving on the freeway at 90 miles an hour, and then they just straight up kill someone? I don't know. I remember, where I grew up, when I was a kid, there was a really bad car accident not far from my house, and it was kind of on this freeway overpass. And 4 people died. It was a drunk driver. And the drunk driver walked away totally fine, but killed 4 people in a van. So I don't understand the logic of, well, just call him an Uber home or just let him drive home. Like, no, like tens of thousands of people die already from this kind of thing.
Yeah, they want 2 tiers of justice where white people and I guess maybe Asians, people with privilege, have to get arrested for DUIs and have to be tackled and tased by police if they're resisting arrest, while blacks can resist arrest and not go to jail for DUIs. And like if they're acting suspicious, you just have to let them be and do whatever they want. Even the family's lawyer for Rayshard was saying that, like, well, he resisted arrest because he was so afraid of what happened to George Floyd. And it's like, so now they have a right to resist. Like they could just like punch a police officer in the face and that's not a crime because they're like afraid. They're in just so much fear.
You see these like propaganda videos where it's like, I saw one the other day where
the police officers, like they were like doing it about like as polite. I don't know if polite is the way. They're like, okay, put your hands behind your back. They weren't using force and they're just putting on the cuffs like it was a normal. And then he began immediately fighting them. And that's when they had to apply force. Like before they weren't even using any force. They weren't using any chokehold. They weren't even pulling out their weapons. They're like, put your hand behind your back. And he's about to put on the cuffs. And and he deserved to be arrested. I mean, he was not safe to drive anywhere, and this is like, and he had not, like, I would have believed, some people would believe this argument, like if he had been in the parking spot and it's clearly like, I'm not going anywhere, I'm trying to be a safe citizen, I'm sleeping, I'd maybe, vouch for the argument that this guy should have just been let off, but he was not doing that. He was not feeling, he did not care about the safety of the public. So there is, I mean, just police officers are just like can't do their job anymore. I mean, there's so many, and there's even so many cases from the riots of police officers being fired or disciplined or even charged because they like assaulted a rioter, and it's like, this is a riot situation. There's been very few arrests of the riots or just any concern for them. Yet any officer who like shoved somebody too hard, they're just like, they're going to be arrested. I mean, even the Buffalo situation, which Trump was, pondering if this is an Antifa super soldier, the 75-year-old man. Again, this 75-year-old man was like getting in their way, and like maybe they shoved him. I mean, okay, they maybe shoved him too hard, but he was like coming at him. He's like, "You can't go," and they like, I mean, they're in a riot situation. They're pumped of adrenaline. They probably didn't realize like how hard they were pushing him, and they pushed him, and they were just following orders. The guy, took a bad fall, and now like those two officers were suspended, and then I think it was like around over 50 officers then resigned from the riot squad over that, or the police response squad. So because those officers are like, these guys were doing what they're supposed to be telling. I mean, they tell them in like riot situations that they have to push everyone back. Like, there's no exceptions, and this guy was clearly not following orders. He was like trying to get in their way and like block their path, and he unfortunately took a bad fall. But
I mean, I don't really know where this ends. The other day I saw something where, I don't know, some local news station, some southern state maybe, was like, this 5-year-old was really afraid when she saw the police driving by at the playground, but then the cop got out and said hi to her, and now she's not afraid anymore. And it's like, okay, now we're indoctrinating the entire next generation that you're supposed to have a literal panic attack if you're just doing nothing and a cop rolls by. I mean, if you actually talk to cops, most of the time, even if they see something minor going on, like they just like the stress these days, the stress of getting out of the car and writing up the report and doing anything, not worth it. And that's going to be the other end of this, where it's like, okay, at what point do cops just stop caring? Not only are there like less cops, they just don't care anymore. They pull back. If they see something, they don't bother with it because it could turn south, and then they have 3 months of paperwork and a court case to deal with. So, I don't even know why cops would get involved anymore unless it's a super serious situation, unless there's like, serious loss of life involved. There doesn't seem to be any upside to being a police officer, being involved in any kind of de-escalation, especially when it's pretty clear most Americans are not capable of de-escalation. They just want to turn it into some kind of civil rights case every time they have an interaction with a cop. So you see this.
Yeah, that's particularly the case with Black Americans.
Yeah,
so many cases. There was like a case where this guy, he got pulled over and it was like for speeding, and the whole time he began yelling and being a dick to the officer. And then the officer was like, he's like, I'm not doing that. And then the officer's like, can you please do this? And eventually he arrested him. And the whole time he's just like mouthing off and this like, and most people are just like, well, just be respectful to the officer. The officer may write you a ticket. He may not. If you're just like so respectful, just like follow orders, and then everyone gets on with their day. Like the less problems you have to cause to the officer, the less problems for you.
Yeah. And honestly, going forward, I don't know how police unions are able to combat this politically. I mean, you have Justin Amash, I think, who proposed a bill in the House to end qualified immunity for all police departments across the country. I mean, how do police unions fight this? So they just contribute to his primary challenger next cycle? Like, I don't, from their perspective, if they lose qualified immunity and if they lose the ability to actually act as police officers and the way they've acted for many decades now, there is zero chance that they will get involved in any kind of potentially violent situation. They're just going to not show up, or they'll show up and kind of monitor it and not get, unless there's like an active shootout, they're not going to do anything.
The Donald Trump policy of monitoring the situation. Yeah, no, they have. There is a serious push for qualified immunity. They could go on strike, but actually the problem is all their bargaining agreement says they cannot go on strike. So if they go on strike, it wipes away most of their benefit of their bargaining position, and they, that screws them over. So they're kind of in a pickle with this situation. I think that what will benefit them is that they're pulling back and they're allowing crime. Once crime increases, the reason why there's such a push for police reform is that most Americans don't experience crime as much as they did in the 80s and 90s. Like everybody in the 1994 crime bill was universally popular among all people, and black communities were desperate for it. They're like, please put these people in jail for a long time. We don't want them in our communities. They're destroying our communities. Please put them in jail. Please give more money for police. We want police here. Please, we want that. And now they're like, oh, we don't want police anymore. The real problem is putting away these drug barons for 25 years, even though this person was like responsible for dozens of deaths. Yeah, we want that person out of jail.
Well, the argument that they use now, which I still can't wrap my head around, but the argument seems to be that more policing leads to more crime. And I've actually spent time trying to understand the logic behind this. And I think that what they're basically saying is that if you police us for the crimes we already commit, we will actively commit more crime because we're angry at having been policed in the first place. So we're going to spite you and spite ourselves because you told us not to do what we were doing initially. Like that's the entire philosophical rationale behind a lot of this. Is like, you cannot police us, you cannot tell us what to do, and if you do, that makes us angry, and when we get angry, we commit more crime. I can't really figure it out any other way.
Though.
Yeah,
I mean, well, that's the argument they claim for why blacks commit more crime. Like, well, they have over policed communities. I mean, if white suburbs are policed just as much. It's like, yeah, cops are in the suburbs. It's like, hey, kid, I saw you jaywalking, and they like put out their baton. That's not really what they want. They want white suburbs over policed, and it's like kids playing basketball are like found in some violation, and then cops bring out the batons and beat them. Like that's really what they want. But that's the argument they use, and maybe there's a way that society is more inclined to defend criminality than it was in the 80s and 90s. And there's put out far more propaganda that like your life is in danger if you're a black person. Like there's this amazing data point that was found by Zach Goldberg, who is one of the people who discovered the Great Awakening. He's done a lot of great data work. And he pointed this out on Twitter. He said, the percent of blacks who think they are treated just as well as whites in their communities was lower in 2018, 18.3%, than it was in the year before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, 23.5%. Objectively speaking, this can't be true. And that's correct. It's like not true at all. But they believe this, that their lives, anytime they step outside the door, that they're going to be murdered by police. And it's just the power of propaganda at work, that they think that, that their lives are more in danger now than at any point in history. And that's why they want this depolicing, because they don't remember how awful it was in the 80s and 90s. And even in some communities where it is bad, they can just, pass it off as over policing, that's the real problem. And so that's what they're going to roll with in this thing. And the main problem, I think, is just white liberals are now fully in favor of this. Like all white liberals in the early 90s wanted tough on crime. I mean, Rudy Giuliani won the mayoral race in 1994, or actually rather 1993, by promising law and order, because, I mean, David Dinkins was turning the city into a shithole. I mean, it was already a shithole, and it was only getting worse under the first black mayor's policy. And a Republican managed to win by saying, like, I'm going to get tough on crime. I have a record as a district attorney of getting tough on crime. Vote for me, and you can finally have safe city streets. And all these white liberals voted for that. And now, like, every white liberal, like, doesn't want police officers unless they see somebody scrawling something racist on their sidewalk, or if somebody threatens them at a Black Lives Matter protest. Like, there's been several funny cases of heated boomer moments of, like, a boomer just, like, starting yelling or threatening protesters, and they're all like have like defund the police signs and like, oh, please call the police. It's
well,
like,
do you remember when that guy showed up with the chainsaw?
Yeah. It's the base Hispanic guy shows up with a chainsaw at this, and they're like, "Call the police!" And there's another time where, like, a base boomer, he got out of his pickup truck with, like, a Freddy Krueger type device, and they're like, "Oh no, call the police!" And they're all like demanding defund the police. Is that they only they don't think that this will affect their personal life because crime isn't around them, but when something like this happens, they're like the first people to dial 911. So I think the only way that police backlash will happen is if they see crime rising in their area, if they don't feel as safe walking around their neighborhoods, if they feel that gentrification is not fully pushing out the criminal element. And once they start, once, like, they're getting mugged more and they're seeing that they can't enjoy their favorite restaurants on a Saturday night and everything like that, then there will be serious consequences. And then I think we'll see a change. But that might have to take more than a few months. It may take a few years. I think crime is going to skyrocket in 2020 based just on these police reform policies. The fact that we don't want to punish criminals and put them away. I don't know if it will return to necessarily early 90s levels, but it will definitely be higher than over the last decade. But, moving on to a similar topic, Trump's response to the riots. It's been weak, to say the least. He continues tweeting law and order while Antifa and Black Lives Matter take over city blocks in Seattle, topple statues all over the country, and impose their will on the general public. Trump can't be seen to do anything. Some people have defended Trump's behavior on the basis that he has to do nothing to prevent a color revolution. A lot of boomers are also saying that Trump not doing anything is good because these are Democrat cities and he's just exposing the racist Democrats and how terrible they are. However, it's hard to see this deferment as different from a coup. The elites are getting everything they want here. So what is your take on the matter?
I don't really think that Trump knows what to do on some level. I think that he probably has an instinct that this is deeply unpopular. If you just kind of monitor Facebook or Twitter or, and I'm not talking about like our circle, but just normal people, and many of whom are not white. They're, Hispanic, some Black, some Asian. You'll see that literally nobody thinks these kind of riots and looting and freeway overpass marches and all this stuff is okay. You'll see hundreds of comments from people with, last name Kim or last name Rodriguez, telling LAPD to run them over as soon as possible. No one really likes this. I think everyone was kind of on board with, maybe there is a problem with police militarization in America. Maybe cops shouldn't act like this. Fine. But then it turned into this sob story over like a literal crackhead. And then it turned into, you need to give us space to destroy and we need to express ourselves and we're fighting the power by burning down your laundromat. And literally nobody in these urban areas thinks that's okay. They're all pretty angry. There's countless pieces of footage of store owners, many of whom, again, are not white, basically confronting looters who are mostly Black with firearms, sometimes even pushing them to the ground with a firearm. I think that Trump could have been widely popular had he come out with a pretty strong stance, authorized live ammunition, authorized use of force, made very serious threats against rioters and looters that they would be prosecuted for multiple felony counts, spend a decade or two in jail. And instead, he kind of dithered. And I think that obviously there's people in his cabinet or in his inner circle telling him that if he gets too tough, he'll lose the black vote. If he gets too tough, he might have problems with Congress. If he gets too tough, he could have just legal problems. But honestly, he should have just ignored all that and just said, whatever, we'll deal with it if it actually happens. And been the guy that put a stop to the rioting and looting on like day 2. Instead, he let it go on for like a week and a half and then decided to actually kind of step up to the plate and do something. But again, no live ammunition, no use of force. None of the rioters or looters were ever really seriously hurt or even seriously detained. So there's really no, I feel like there's no real threat. If you want to go riot and loot and attack people, you basically can get away with it right now. If there was another round of rioting, easily they could burn down another city like Minneapolis and get away with it, no problem. And that's ultimately because Trump I don't blame him for allowing Minneapolis to burn, but he should have immediately, on day 2 of that, stepped in and said, look, if we see you throwing a Molotov cocktail, maybe it doesn't work out well for you, maybe that's the last day you're throwing a Molotov cocktail. But instead it was, Black Lives Matter. This isn't honoring the death of George Floyd. This whole line that the riots are besmirching the legacy of the convicted felon and woman abuser. It's all become very, very cringe, and Trump just has not been able to kind of rise above it.
Yeah, and that's the case. I think you made a good point. He waited too long. If he had waited on that, if he had done his speech on Monday, Saturday afternoon, he would have been applauded. And I think that was actually at the peak of people wanting to send in the military. And Friday was showing that this has gone national. I mean, every city was having rioting. In Washington D.C., like in front of his house, it was he had to go to the bunker, do the violence, but he did nothing on Saturday. I mean, his Saturday response was saying, we're having MAGA night that Saturday, which no one has still to this day figured out what MAGA night is. And there's just such these stupid responses. Like, they didn't respond. He waited too long, and by Monday the riots were already petering out, and so the media was able to say that, oh, he's going after peaceful protesters because the level of violence was lower on that Monday as opposed to Saturday and Friday as well. And so there's much more of a demand for the law and order earlier. And now, like, when they're seeing it's peaceful protesters, like, oh, well, you can't do anything. And now it's easier for them to get away with this stuff because it's just them gathering and throwing down a statue. And they're like, well, they're not really hurting anybody. And they can't really it's totally in the mayor's position to do anything. And these mayors don't want to do anything about them toppling statues or, attacking people who are defending the statues, as we saw in New Mexico, where, a total example of anarcho-tyranny is there was like some local militias trying to defend a conquistador statue, and the Antifa people were attacking him and were even saying, like, beat him to death. And then he pulled out a gun and shot him. And the only people, first off, that city is taking down the statue. And, the whole government is trying to press severe charges against the militia guys. Of course, nothing against the leftists who are trying to pull down the statue.
I actually saw an interesting take. I can't remember who made it, but that from the perspective of people like Jacob Frey, that's the mayor of Minneapolis, from the perspective of people like Frey and others, allowing statues and allowing public monuments, allowing public property to be destroyed, honestly, from a budgetary standpoint, alone, especially given kind of the collapse in state and municipal revenues right now, is perfect. Because there's now zero upkeep. You can go to the federal government and say, hey, we need an emergency grant, or we need money, we need federal aid to rebuild the damage. So you get to then remove these budgetary items for the year or 2 years. You get to have the feds rebuild it all for you. And in the end, you can then dictate what the statues will be. So a lot of these statues were built decades ago. And the current mayors like Frey probably, obviously sympathize with these people and he probably wants a lot of that police precinct. He probably wants public monuments or public buildings, streets to have been destroyed so that he could rebuild them a certain way that was more, I guess, poignant. So it's perfect from their standpoint because they're basically going to charge the federal government, so the national U.S. taxpayer, to completely rebrand their city or their municipality. From their perspective, it is the ultimate sort of long-term support for this cause, which is forcing people out in the sticks who pay taxes to finance the reconstruction of new urban zones for people that burned it down the year prior. They're basically rewarded with what they wanted after having burned it down, and someone else pays for it for them. And on top of that, this basically ensures that all the local business owners who might have been opposed to this sort of thing, well, they have been seriously impacted or their business was just completely destroyed. So if you have friends in escrow for commercial real estate or who want to buy these lots, who want to give money to your campaign or give money to your little pet cause, what better way than to give them the zoning rights or help them get it through escrow? This will be in a lot of these areas the entrenchment of the current political figures. Like Jacob Frey might seem kind of weak now, but him and whoever's kind of behind him will definitely be in power for decades because I guarantee you that they're going to grant all of the rebuilding projects and all the contracts for all that commercial real estate to whoever lines their pockets. And it's basically one big smash and grab operation. I think that ultimately you kind of saw Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, and he seemed totally confused about what was going on when this kind of broke out. And he basically just laid out a whole list of possible characters. Like he said the Mexican cartel might have been involved.
And white nationalists, of course.
White nationalists.
I think I said this on a previous podcast, and I was saying that the reason why he accused white nationalists of it is so he could gen up public outrage to use excessive force against these people. And by calling Antifa white nationalists, then all the liberals like, oh, use lethal force if possible. We need to do this. And it's a way of... It's an effective form of propaganda, unfortunately, that if we want police crackdown, we have to imagine that white nationalists or far-right extremists are involved. And I think that was a point that, I think he knew that there was no white nationalists there. He just said that, these Antifa guys are white. And he's like, white people burning down buildings. They must be white nationalists, so we'll call them white nationalists. And this will allow us to use the National Guard. And I think it was a propaganda point on his part.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I agree with you that was maybe his calculus, but you can tell that most of the governors seem to be kind of confused about what's going on. Cuomo seems kind of angry that this is happening. The governor of North Carolina came out and seemed pretty pissed off about what was kind of minimal rioting in North Carolina. I think that ultimately the governors themselves don't seem too interested in having to deal with this for a variety of perspectives, because it's just not politically viable from a state level. If you think in North Carolina, if the governor comes out as having been too soft on a couple of riots down in like Raleigh, Durham, and Fayetteville, he could lose the next election easily, because the rest of the state will just see him. Oh, like he's the guy that was pro riot in those two cities, and we have, as North Carolina taxpayers, we have to pay to fix that, and we can't go in the city anymore. The local politicians in these places seem to be totally in love with it. The mayor of Atlanta, like I said,
the mayor of Birmingham even
yeah.
went down there and helped them tear down the
like
statues. So there is I mean, the whole left and even a lot of the right doesn't even care that much about the riots. I mean, the vast majority of responses, with like the exception of like Tom Cotton and to a lesser extent Trump, has just focused in on the righteousness of the protests and how awful George Floyd's death is. Like, George Floyd's death is apparently the greatest tragedy to ever occur in human history. I think I just retweeted a video where these people are out in the spot where he died, and it's all these white people, and they're just like wailing, and they're just like being comforted by blacks. It's like it's like Lords or something. It's this a shrine they go to gain healing and understanding in a spiritual moment by standing in the spot where George Floyd was arrested and died. And that this is something that we all need to come around. And it's something, going on to the point that we're experiencing a massive cultural revolution at this time, especially among white liberals. I think, I mentioned Mr. Goldberg, the guy who's done a lot of, not to be confused, no relation to Jonah Goldberg, I hope, but he's done a lot of great work on the Great Awakening. And we're fully seeing this effect with these protests, with most of the peaceful protests, that there's been a switch to peaceful protests as goofy white liberals have taken over the demonstrations. And now they just want to march through the street and get their photo ops and worship blacks. This is the main goal of the protest, and it's now less violent, with like far left Antifa and ghetto types like being at the forefront of this. And, there are so many things. It's not just with the demonstrations we're seeing the cultural revolution. I mean, high school kids are informing on their racist peers, parents, and teachers, creating lists so they can destroy them for the rest of their lives. College athletes want any vestiges of so-called white supremacy removed from their campuses, from the alma mater to buildings named after people who owned slaves, et cetera, et cetera. Statues to American founders and heroes are toppled, and schools in their honor are renamed. Random people risk getting their life ruined if they dare post an anti-Black Lives Matter Facebook post. We've seen many stories of like Black Twitter be like, "Hey, yo, Twitter, do your thing," and it's some guy like, "I don't stand with Black Lives Matter," and then like, this gets like 10,000 retweets, and they post like his home address, like all of his relatives' home address, and they're like, "Yep, you need to learn your lesson for standing against us." Do you see an end to this cultural revolution? What do you see as the end point here?
Oh God. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think. Well, on like the whole kids going and doxing their fellow high schoolers or their parents, which is pretty wild. I feel like that started a month or 2 months ago. The first big one that comes to mind was when that girl ratted on her two friends who made kind of a private video, or not friends. I don't know, kids at her high school.
Yeah, it was a TikTok video.
Yeah, it was a TikTok.
There's been several incidents over the last few years of just like white people making, or white high schoolers making these TikTok and Snap videos that like have offensive jokes. And then, as I was saying, like Black Twitter, like, "Hey, yo, Black Twitter, do your thing." And it's actually usually not Black Twitter. It's usually like an Arab or an Indian or an Asian. It's usually actually rarely a Black person with the initial video. And they're just like demanding blacks destroy these white people for like doing some stupid joke on TikTok. And a lot of times it doesn't even have a slur. It's just like making fun of racial stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think what that one I'm thinking of was about in the video.
Well, I think you're thinking of there's like these two white high schoolers who had this video where they like displayed the N-word, and it was like a bathroom video. It was like a strange video, but they had two high schoolers and they both got like dropped from their colleges, and that
they got expelled from their high school.
Yeah, they were expelled from the high school, and I think they were both on their way. So, and then this just set off a whole trend of just like non-whites trying to find any white person who did something they didn't like, and them like, "Ayo, Twitter, do your thing." And then like this like 16-year-old who did like sang along to rap lyrics is now like banned from his high school, can't get into a college. His home address is posted on the internet. His parents are getting threatened, and they think that this is like a warranted response. So like the George Floyd protests just added more fuel to that fire, because this has been happening all throughout the time of coronavirus, because like people are at home, they're bored, they're restless, they're making TikTok and Snapchat videos to pass the time. And a lot of people just like decided to make more offensive stuff, and a lot of people are just angry, so they decided to vent on this matter. So yeah, but now it's just now being carried on into a much more accelerated pace.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an escalation. I guess it's one thing to like go after your peers at high school. Then it's starting to go into like, there was that girl from Louisiana who goes on and she's like, "I can't wait to leave Louisiana. Everyone here is so racist." And she's like basically gives out her parents' names and like talks shit about her parents. I don't know.
Yeah, those videos are the best. Now, there was like one hilarious video where they had like a daughter, and they're on like a camping trip, and she's like crying. She's like, "You won't say Black Lives Matter," and then the dad is like in there, is like, "Look." They're like, I don't know. They're like names like Sarah. It's like, "Sarah, you're ruining the whole weekend. We already told you we're tired of talking about this topic." And it's just the dad who's like been working all week. He's just trying to have an enjoyable weekend. And his daughter is just being hella annoying. And she's like, "You won't say it. How can you not support justice and equality?" And the dad's like, "Look, you said your thing. We're tired of talking about it. That's it." And it's just like that's probably too young to be a boomer. Right? He's like a Gen X dad, just like saying
can you imagine just working your ass off to support this kid with a dainty lifestyle, and this is what she does in your time off?
Yeah, and she makes a video to whole shame you. I think fortunately with that one, it's like different from the Louisiana one. I think in that most people thought it was like too hilarious to actually get upset with. I mean, it's like a very funny video. But there was another case in Mississippi where this daughter decided to post like all these private text messages from her parents using racial slurs and everything like that. And she's like 22, and she's like posting her home address and doxing them. And Mississippi police, fortunately arrested her and booked her on charges. And we're like, "Thank you, police, for taking this woman and like for trying to destroy her family and stuff." And it's always the daughter as well. It's always the white daughter.
I have not seen a single son do this. Like no son would do this. Yeah.
There is a problem. I mean, a lot of people on our side say like, "Oh, you guys hate on white women too much," like, blah, blah, blah. It's not necessarily hating on white women. It's that white women are responding far more to the left-wing propaganda that they're inundated with on a daily basis. And they're the ones who are advancing it far more than anyone else. Is that you have to realize is that gay marriage is now legal in part because white women were programmed to think that like, "Oh, I all want a gay best friend," and they're just love is love, and they got programmed to this. The reason why Black Lives Matter is so powerful is because white women have been programmed. The largest difference from 2015, or actually it was 2014 polling versus now on whether these police-involved killings are reflective of a large-scale systemic racism is due to white women. There's been a 38% difference between now and 2014. 38% more white women view this as a serious threat. I think it's around 70% of white women see that these killings of George Floyd are indicative of systemic racism. They account for the largest difference. Jesus. So it happens even with Gen Z, and the studies show that like Gen Z white males are actually fairly conservative. They're not as like liberal as you would think. They're more likely to believe that there's discrimination against whites. They don't support affirmative action. They're more open to immigration restrictions. But like Gen Z white females are just like, are really more left wing than any previous generation. And this is something that we have to acknowledge and say. I don't like people are just like, oh, just like this is misogyny or sexism, blah, blah, blah. We have to respect them. And it's like, well, like you have to understand of like who are the foot soldiers for advancing leftism. And unfortunately, right now, the most effective foot soldiers they have are white women. I mean, it's not all white. I mean, not all not all white women.
I mean, there's a huge chunk of it that, I mean, on some level, it is just women in general. One thing I've noticed is that there's a massive female component to the not only the looting and the rioting, but just the general sort of histrionics you'll see with these protests.
I want to just to one point. I think with the looting and rioting, it's been largely male, but the ones who making up these protests, especially when you look at these suburban protests, it's like 75% female, and it's like even with the among non-white groups, it's like seems like there's an overwhelming overrepresentation of women.
Yeah, I honestly, I mean, my one of my hotter takes is that if you removed women from this equation, like if women were not out there with the rioting or even the protesting, this would probably be more peaceful. It would have probably been more orderly. It would have been more peaceful. It would have probably not descended into like hysterics and craziness. I don't even see a lot of black men in some of these protests, like the DC protests. You watch the footage, I saw maybe 10% of those people marching were black men, maybe. I mean, probably less. They seemed pretty few and far between, not only just in the general population of that protest, but just in the men in general. It seemed to be primarily white and various kinds of Asian were like the most prominent men involved. But the women will be carrying the ones that are like the craziest signs, where it's like Haitian Revolution 2020 edition or some crazy shit like that.
That is true.
Yeah,
I think on a social level that women are enabling this. I don't necessarily think that they're the one. I think it's just that the social popularity of it is due to women getting involved in this, and they've been the most receptive to the programming, just because women in general don't really like going against the herd. They like to follow what's popular. They're told that this is good, that this is moral. They want to be seen as good, and they think that like racism is the worst thing. And I think what we're seeing with a lot of this cultural revolution, that it's primarily female driven. Outside of the rioting and looting, is that the people like compiling docs lists and like saying like, I heard this kid in my geography class make a racist joke, like here's his home address and everything, and they're like, Twitter, do your thing. Like this 14-year-old is ruined for life over like making a banana joke or something. And
I'm wondering where this is eventually going to lead to, because I remember reading about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, I don't know, a couple of years ago. And I went back and looked at something, and there was this thing called the Four Olds. And it was basically the mission, for what to accomplish. And the idea was old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. And eventually it didn't take long before they were not only attacking their own families, like that took less than a year in the Cultural Revolution. People were selling out their families to the state for them to be shot. Then it descended into like, okay, we're going to go dig up great grandfather's grave and desecrate his body because he was an imperial servant, or he was in the imperial army in the 19th century China. They dug up, I think, several emperors' graves and desecrated or destroyed their bodies and stole all the treasure and works of art inside. I do wonder if that's where it's headed. Once they move beyond monuments and statues, museums, they'll move to graveyards, they'll move to headstones, they'll move to mausoleums, they'll move to family heirlooms, whatever, and they'll trash it, or they'll sell it, or they'll do bring a mob to it. I think that once you feel comfortable going after your own family, and once you feel comfortable condoning that people go after their own family, it's inevitable that everything is fair game, even the dead. So you can basically just go dig up and desecrate bodies of people that you hate. I mean, I don't know where Robert E. Lee is buried, but I would certainly be stationing armed guards near that mausoleum for the remaining future, because in 3 to 6 months, who knows if that's going to be a target for some kind of mob or something that can overpower the local cops.
And yeah, that's already their target. I mean, in that bill, with renaming Confederate our bases named after Confederate generals, they're saying that all Confederate monuments and national cemeteries, including Arlington National Cemetery, which is where I believe Robert E. Lee is buried. I mean, don't quote me. I think he's at Washington Lee, University. So, and then they've already tried to remove that as well.
I mean, they did it to Franco. I don't know if you saw. I think it was.
Yeah, they moved his body. Yeah, they execrated his body, and they exhumed his body, and they removed it from its resting place. And they're already going to start to do that. I think it was in Georgia. There was a cemetery that was vandalized, and they dug up like graves. They thought it was like full of Confederate soldiers, and they were throwing like the remains out of the coffins and everything like that. So it's already going to the cemeteries, like the final resting places. They do want to eliminate any traces of American history that does not comport to the current progressive orthodoxy. And I'm not sure where the end point is. I think the one thing is Trump is smart enough to realize that defending the monuments is a smart political strategy, because I think people realize that they're going to go too far, and I don't see people that, even though they're not doing anything about them tearing down the statues, it's just not good optics. People just feel very uncomfortable about it, even though the standard liberal elites are all supporting it. There was a Popular Mechanics website was giving the best tips to how to pull down a statue without getting hurt. So there are these examples, but Trump is at least willing to stand up to that. But I think one of the reasons why Trump has suffered so much is that he's had this mixed response, is that he's tried to cater to Black Lives Matter while also trying to maintain a tough law and order facade. But nobody really believes he's getting that tough on law and order. I mean, they all say we used tear gas against peaceful protesters, but that was just one occasion. And we have so much lawlessness now that it doesn't seem like he's able to do anything. And I think that it is going to hurt his, political chances going forward, because it doesn't seem like his base has high morale right now. It seems very demoralized at this point. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't see nearly the amount of support for Trump that I saw in 2016. I mean, I wasn't as active in the dissident scene in 2016. I mean, I was like a commenter on Social Matter, but what I did see on Twitter and other places, and just in general, my day-to-day life, was a relative amount of enthusiasm, either for or against him. It was the most talked about subject throughout all aspects of my life. Even at work, people were pretty incensed about it, one direction or the other, especially in the week leading up to the election. With this, I don't see a lot of enthusiasm one way or the other. There is the permanent and perennial Trump reply guys, or I think you talked about this, Dr. Eugene Goo, or the Krasenstein wife, who are every post. Donald, while what you said may be true, have you considered X? You should kill yourself now, or
it's like time to resign, Donnie. You're going to jail. And on the opposite side, the pro-Trump reply guys are just they're really trying to stretch and find any response to justify Trump's behavior. They're he's letting as I was saying, he's letting Democrat cities burn. It's
that was the biggest cope I've ever seen, and
it's not even convincing. It's not. It is cope. It's a cope. It's not even convincing at all. And Trump's not even using this argument. None of the arguments that we're coming up with is or the convincing or what he's using. And a lot of people are making the reasonable conclusion that we have to make Trump lose because he's so terrible and everything like that. I'm starting to more agree with that, but I think that at the same time that if you're punishing, like what happens with our votes, people are going to vote whatever the way. I'm not telling anybody to vote one way or the other. And I don't know necessarily if Trump really deserves anyone's votes by his behavior, but I think people have this rosy image of that if Trump is punished, if he loses, then our message is heard. Like you should have been tougher on the riots. You should have done more on immigration. You should have actually fulfilled your 2016 campaign promise. But I'm worried that it'll actually have the opposite effect because people will just imagine that Trump actually wanted to be tough on the riots, that he was too extreme on immigration and everything like this. And it'll have the opposite of message if Trump loses. It's like, I wish there was like a better alternative. I wish there was something that like we were the people that Trump had to appeal to the most in this election. He really should do more to appeal to his core middle American base, which we seek to represent or seek to articulate their point of view. But what happens after the election is that if he loses, the message will be he lost because he was a racist.
Yeah,
he lost because he was trying to be a fascist. It won't be he lost because he wasn't racist enough or he wasn't nationalist enough. And that's the unfortunate matter. I know, and there is a point that depending on how college educated whites vote, which I think that will be the deciding factor, is if they are, turned strongly against him, even with it from a data point, it won't be because he was he wasn't nationalist enough.
Yeah, they're going to say that Trump lost because he was a trade restrictionist, right? That in America rejected, federal infrastructure investment and trade restriction and immigration restriction.
They rejected isolationism.
Yes,
Americans want a war in Syria.
America wants globalization. So like the caricature of Trump that they've constructed, that Trump is literally dismantling NATO or whatever, they're going to say that, well, obviously the American public supports a strong partnership with NATO in which we spend $100 billion or more every year to protect countries that like have massive commercial relations with Russia. Like it's basically it's a con job. So, on some level, I can totally see this playing out where Trump loses and they're like, well, very, very clearly the American public is much more open to globalization, much more open to trade agreements, much more open to immigration, much more open to liberal cultural issues. And we really need to learn a lot. And the GOP will just be completely defenestrated. They'll basically look at that and say, well, we just have to support everything we were supporting 15 years ago, except worse. We have to go full bore now. We can't even pretend to listen to those people. And so then you basically...
They'll have a similar interpretation to the 2012 loss. They issued a famous autopsy report in early 2013 that said the most important thing they must do is support and pass amnesty in order to survive. And we're going to see something like that in the autopsy report of 2021, where it's like, we must create a welcoming and inclusive GOP that doesn't build on like fear and hate and includes Americans of all races. And it'll probably even include like whites it'll probably include like something that whites will be a minority in 2040. Thus, we should stop appealing so much to whites. We need to appeal to all these ethnic groups. And it'll be even say stuff about like pro-LGBT and et cetera, et cetera. And this will... Now, some people may argue, well, that will lead to a serious decline in the GOP, but it's not like there's going to be a replacement to the GOP anytime soon. The GOP will continue to slug on. It may even win in 2024 with this terrible platform, which could be the worst thing ever. And this could happen. That's the complete opposite effect of this. Because I think, Joe Biden presidency could be a total disaster. Like we could get involved in some war some stupid war in the Middle East or Africa or anywhere where there's like thousands of Americans dead and there's like no real arguments for it. And they'll like vote for the GOP again, even though they'll be on the same page of everything.
And all the trade restrictions that are currently in place or were planned for the Chinese come off, and they basically flood the market again. And this time they'll do it in a very deliberate way, where they'll realize like, oh, we didn't act fast enough to destroy the American steel industry, because they got pissed off and elected a guy who almost put our steel industry out of business. So we're gonna flood their I-beam market with something that's a quarter of their production price, and basically destroy every American steel town north of Pennsylvania. I think that if Biden is elected, or if GOP wins on this horrible platform of basically just conceding everything, all of the attempts at fixing the American economy are going to go out the window. And you'll ultimately have, you could have a war, but what you definitely will have either way is 40, 50 million people underemployed, permanently unemployed, basically like no manufacturing base. And you wind up with in the situation of Portugal or some kind of low rent Euro country that doesn't really make anything, doesn't do anything, and just kind of trots along, pretending to still be important. That's what you're looking at if you get any kind of rejection of what Trump was trying to do. You're basically looking at the end of an important America. It's just going to be irrelevant.
Yeah, and some people say that that's actually good because then that'll wake white Americans up to their plight. But I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I mean, right now, you should be waking up millions of white Americans that they're either embracing or they're just accepting the lawlessness, or they just have no earthly idea to do. I don't know necessarily. Worse is not always better. It's usually actually just worse. And I think these same Americans will still be voting for GOP because that's the only choice they have. There's not necessarily an alternative. And I think people can say, and even for like nationalists on a personal level, it'll be worse. Like, Kamala Harris is definitely going to be either vice president or attorney general, and she will be using the power of the state to go after political dissidents. And life will be much worse. Like, you think that tech censorship and state persecution is bad now? Well, it can get a lot worse, and nobody's going to give a shit under a Democratic administration.
I mean, you can literally have European hate speech laws come into effect.
Yeah, we could have that, and none of this is necessarily good. Like, people think like, oh, if we get more persecution and that'll be good. It's like, well, people don't really sympathize with our. Not that many Americans sympathize with the cause. A lot of Americans will be like, yeah, that you deserve it, that you're kicked off of every tech platform imaginable. You can't have a bank account. I mean, it's not necessarily good for the idea. I mean, I just talked with Martin Sellner last week, and he's like deplatformed from everything. I mean, he's now on his 19th bank account. This is not helping his movement or cause that happening. Yeah. And this could be like this for anybody. I mean, so there's like and the circumstances, like, I'm more open to the idea that a lot of what we need is a decline or retreat of American global power, that the fact that we are a superpower is why we can't make our country great again, is that we can't make our country be less paused and actually be up for, traditional values and everything like that, is because we're this we're the homo empire, as some people have said. We're the global homo is making us a pause, and by undermining our institutions and by having the rest of the world like stop caring about like America, this in a lot of ways is good. And the only way, the better option for having that happen, and also having a chance at the solving tech censorship and having less state persecution, that's all under Trump. Now, necessarily, I don't think that people should go out and campaign, or people should really make their messaging about Trump, because Trump really doesn't deserve that. I just think if from, an outside observer standpoint, if you're like, it's almost like watching a basketball game or something, and you're like, well, I'd prefer that team to win because it'd be better for me. Like, I'm betting on it, and like that would be better for my situation, and really the right situation if Trump just stays in. And there's still opportunities to influence the GOP under Trump versus if he loses, the GOP could go on a massive purging spree, and so with Conservative Inc., and that a lot of these ideas would be discredited and they'll be more fervently anti-racist, and it'll be harder to create. People want to say like, well, that's just an incentive to create parallel institutions. Well, that's going to be hard when every tech platform deplatforms you and the government is, suing you and trying to put you in jail. Like, it makes it much harder. You have with what is there, and this is what we have, and we have to make the best of it. And I think people want to feel like they have the power to do something. And by voting against Trump, it's a way of just like sticking to him. Now, granted, like, I think there's a lot of that's like a warranted position. I mean, yeah, especially with after the riots of how he's reacted to the riots. I'm just like, a lot of times like, screw Trump, this sucks. But I think that just the general circumstances will be better under the Trump presidency, and there will be better opportunities for something actually good to arise. And I think it will continue to delegitimize these institutions and encourage a retreat of American global power, which, a lot of bad things are going to happen under the Democrats, as you pointed. So I think we just need to have a realistic assessment of what will happen here.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't think a lot of people understand, too, that regardless of who gets elected, at the end of the day, the Western alliance, which is what is like one of the hot topics of these people, is basically dead. Mostly just because the era of fears of communism are over, and so the anxieties of the Reagan era are gone. And so this is like a thing that we've tried to drill into the heads of normal conservatives is, look, Reagan's dead. That era was 40 years ago now. I mean, it has no bearing anymore. And same with the foreign policy. So I can totally foresee a future where, especially the Democrats, basically get into some massive foreign policy blunder because they're still operating with these assumptions of the liberal Western alliance as a cohesive entity, when the reality is that most of these states are far more interested in exploring, particularly an energy relationship with the Russians. So I can completely foresee that they get America enmeshed in something very stupid with very little support. And I think on some level, too, trying to punish Trump by saying, oh, I'm going to vote against him, I don't know what you're really accomplishing. I mean, I think Peter Brimelow said it on your show. He's said it multiple times all over the place over the years, especially as Trump kind of started to decline in 2018. The end of the day, Donald Trump is not Hillary Clinton. Like, at the end of the day, Donald Trump is not X. That is the best thing you can still say about him. Donald Trump is not Kamala Harris, who very, very likely could be the next de facto president of the United States. Donald Trump, whatever you want to say about him, at least he's not crazy enough to allow people, allow what Kamala Harris would do. If you think that the recent decision by Gorsuch on the Supreme Court was bad, just wait until the court is passed. I mean, literally FDR style passed by someone as insane as Harris or God forbid Klobuchar or whatever. These people will not only kind of defensively stake their claim, they will aggressively come after you. And they will use the Supreme Court. They'll use everything in their power to pursue you. So voting against Trump to teach him a lesson, I don't know what you're teaching him. He's going to be dead in less than 10 years. He's an old man. He's not going to give a shit about your lesson.
He's not going to come out and apologize. It's like, I apologize to the Graper Army. Unfortunately, I would like that, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Right. I think people need to.
How terrible a left-wing administration would be is that if you all remember that terrible law professor who spoke at the Trump's impeachment hearing, Pamela Karlan, she was like, I'm a lesbian, I'm a proud lesbian Jewish leftist, and she's like up there and she's just like lecturing about Trump. They want her on the Supreme Court. Now imagine that person like having power over your life and not just being some stupid law professor. I mean, she has a lot of influence.
She joined the advisory board for Google, I think.
Or Facebook.
I mean,
she's on the review board to see like what posts are bad. And this is like somebody who is going to have tremendous power. So these are the people that you're going to see. You're going to have Pamela Karlan and like those like type of people. And it's just going to be so bad. And I don't think that like things get worse that like white Americans are just going to rise up. Like that's not really the case. And also for a lot of white Americans, life is still good. As long as they keep their head down, they can still have the good life. And unless there's like a tremendous decline in the economy, which even after coronavirus, I know you've talked about this a little bit on your podcast and in your tweets, is that there could be serious economic consequences. I don't think those are going to be long term. I think people are still going to have the opportunities to achieve some semblance of the middle class dream. They'll have more debt. They'll have to spend more on their kids' education. There'll probably be more unhappiness, but they can still achieve economic prosperity. And that is one reason why there's so many white Americans who don't want to embrace radical ideas, is because they're like, well, if I embrace this, I'll lose my job. I'll lose my wife. I'll lose my kids. I'll lose my reputation. Everyone will hate me, and there will be no community support for it. And then like people are like, well, you should do it anyway because it's the truth. And it's like, well, I mean, there's odd people like me and you who will just do it anyway, but that's not most people. Most people need some really good argument that this will make their life better. And I don't think the dissident right through the radical means really offer that well. I think with like using like something like national populist agenda, like their life will get better. But I think if somebody who's like, I promise you revolution and you'll be fighting in the streets for a cause, and even though we'll all hate
you, the 1930s are dead, folks. Like that existed in a very specific era, and maybe there is room for revolutionary politics, but I would say we need 21st century revolutionary politics. We need, something that is American, first of all. Second of all, actually comports with kind of the world and the problems we're living in, which are very different from the 1930s in some ways. Yes. And I think that ultimately this notion that, okay, we're gonna get to this economic collapse, and then we're gonna really get people revved up and ready for for whatever in the streets, and global revolution. Most people are just flat out not interested in that, and I hate to tell you, but most people were not even interested in that in certain countries in the 1930s. It was certainly not the majority. So I think that at the end of the day, if you want to be convincing and you want to appeal to people like on like a national populist economic agenda, that's probably even more preferable than revolutionary politics, because revolutionary politics, everyone who has a brain cell can easily understand, okay, this could be bad. Like this could be violent. This could be really ugly. A lot of people could get hurt. People could die. So most people are more interested in fixing their lives, fixing their problems. Like if you go to someone and say, hey, I know how to fix your mortgage. Like I know how to fix the housing market. I know how to fix the fact that the plastic fabrication plant in your town closed up. They are going to care a lot more about that than, hey, have you heard of Siege by James Mason?
Oh yeah, something crazy is like Reed Dugan or something. There's like all these like crazy things that they think that if like building the perfect ideological Rubik's Cube, if they figure it out, it's like, haha, I figured it out. This is the ultimate anti-liberal ideology that this will carry them to success. And it's not necessarily the case. That there's a lot of practical matters you have to address, and in particular your political moment. You have to seize the political moment in order to be a successful to have a successful movement. And I think a lot of people need to realize that. And I don't think that under a Trump loss, I think we do need to work, on something beyond Trump and work on institutions. Like, everyone is for that. Nobody thinks that like Trump is the messiah, but he does create circumstances that are more favorable for a cause and more favorable for creating a permanent and effective movement in order to make America great and make America great again and save the West. So like you have to accept the circumstances. I don't think we should think that we're necessarily rooting for Trump or like we're on the team, we're like campaigning for, we're volunteering. Like, I don't think you should do that, but I think you should understand that it would still be better under Trump. But, moving on to the final question I have, this actually comes from a patron, and all people at the patron level of Highly Respected's Patreon page, which still exists right now for the most part, can ask questions on the show. Think of it like super chats. If everyone pays a certain amount, they get to ask the questions. So we now have that for Highly Respected. And this question comes from patron Sean P. He asks, how would you compare Jeff Sessions' tenure as AG versus Barr? Sessions was more in tune with the MAGA movement, but it always came across to me like he didn't have a firm grip over his department. When Barr came in, he reeked of swamp, but it seems surprisingly better at pushing through policy, especially on immigration restrictions. Did we luck into a good and effective AG and Barr, or would we have been better off with Sessions? Now, this is a great question, and thanks for your support, Sean. But from the optics perspective and a PR perspective, Barr looks more in control and stronger in these situations such as impeachment and even with the unrest. He looks more like he is Trump's rock in these situations, and he is preventing like a coup or something worse happening to Trump in these cases. And I don't think he really has. He wouldn't have necessarily had those optics with Sessions, but Sessions was much more of a leader on the policy front. I don't think if Barr had been selected in early 2017, if he would have made these changes to the immigration courts to speed up the process of deportation and adding more immigration judges and also limiting the standards for how they could stay. I don't think he would have led the front on sanctuary cities, which Sessions tried to do, even though the courts were preventing him from doing that. I don't think Barr would have led and fought off criminal justice reform when he was in office. I mean, Sessions was the main reason that they didn't try criminal justice reform in Trump's first 2 years. And he was also eliminating a lot of the Obama era policies that was hurting police departments from effectively doing that. Now all that stuff is back in place or even worse, but Sessions was much more of a policy leader. He was a pretty effective AG outside of matters that related to Trump scandals. He was much better than, I think Barr is much better when it comes to preventing a strong front, when it comes to impeachment and in these riots. I think that we would have seen something weirder if Trump had a weak AG in the wake of these riots. I think Barr was trying to bring in as many people from outside departments and not from the military.
Barr was like hiring mercenaries.
Yeah, there was I think he was trying to bring in all these people who he could count on for being loyal to Trump. Yeah. Because there's something very weird going on. I think he did prevent something that was that. And so I think Trump, from a policy front, Sessions was much better, but from a, defending the president from the so-called deep state, I think Barr is better at that. I think Sessions was still, a better leader. I think right now Sessions is better in the Senate than he was in Attorney General. I don't think there would have been a better Attorney General at that time. Bill Barr wasn't even on Trump's radar. I think he was just suggested as like when he got rid of Sessions. So like, who's somebody who can get through, who supports me? And they're like, there's this guy, Bill Barr. He's like, he likes you, and we think we can get him through. And they're like, okay, we'll get him. I think that was their
Barr seems basically like he is a long time bureaucrat, potentially former spook. I guess you're never really a former spook, but he is a man of DC completely. Like his whole life has been based there. So I can see the logic for getting him as we need to enact certain policy agendas, and we need to have a strong legal defense against this Russia hoax phenomenon. Remember Russiagate? Remember when that was a thing?
Or impeachment.
Yeah, I remember like maybe 30 years ago. Remember like we were trying to impeach the president. But yeah, so I think those are the two primary reasons. Like Bill Barr is a guy who really understands DC legalese. He understands the DC legal bureaucracy. He understands Justice Department. He understands the interplay probably between the Justice Department and the federal labyrinth and the intelligence services, whatever that actually is. And he also definitely seemed animated about the legal foundation for opposing the underlying Mueller legal finding. And this seemed to be really just a battle over kind of not only like legal ideology, but legal functionality, and they're thinking about the future of what presidents can and cannot do. So I think that Bill Barr was, I guess, a smart choice, because the guy is basically going to ensure that you will not get impeached. You're not going to have any major legal problems. Now, is he a hardcore immigration restrictionist and populist guy like Jeff Sessions? No, Bill Barr doesn't give a shit what people think about him. But maybe at the end of the day, this was a smart choice. I don't know. And if Trump wins, perhaps Bill Barr, having served his purpose, will have been then extricated from the White House. I mean, we were all kind of worried in 2016 when Paul Manafort was for some time the campaign advisor or campaign manager for Donald Trump. And everyone was like, oh God, the DC swamp has Donald Trump. They've compromised him. They have Paul Manafort. And then Trump just fired Manafort.
Yeah, Manafort didn't really have any influence.
Yeah.
I think it'd be better if Barr stays on. I don't know if there's really anyone better to replace him. I think Trump, Sessions actually led on the policy front, and now Barr is just keeping those policies in place. He's been largely good. I don't think he was not a fan of Trump's criminal justice reforms, but he was not leading the fight against it. I mean, it had already been put in place by the time he was appointed.
I mean, Bill Barr, I think the other day I saw that he recommended the execution for a bunch of child molesters.
Child murder. Yeah, he's trying to bring back federal death penalty.
I mean, he is from the George Bush senior crowd, and that's the kind of the faction that he belonged to for some time in his life. And if you remember, these are the same guys that ran campaign ads against Dukakis, in their support.
The Willie Horton ads.
Yeah, the Willie Horton ads in support of the death penalty for capital murder, for all kinds of offenses. H.W. Bush was, fire up the electric chair for hundreds of prisoners a year. And Bill Barr kind of comes, I think, from that legal and probably personal tradition of, if you commit certain crimes, you're fucking dead. That's just the end of it. We don't really want to pay the Federal Bureau of Prisons for 50 years to keep you alive. Just put a needle in your arm. So I think that ultimately, maybe you're right. It's good to keep someone like Barr around. Maybe also just because who the hell else is actually going to take that job? I mean, at this point, it seems like trying to go through confirmation to be a part of the Trump White House is a Herculean task and probably not worth it. So
exactly. Well, on that point, that's all the time we have today. Thanks for coming on, Hans. And how can people find your work?
You can go to myth20c.wordpress.com. That is the main site for Myth of 20th Century. We got thrown off YouTube last year, so we're on BitChute as well. And check out The American Sun. I think probably a good amount of you already know of it, but that is a online magazine that I helped start with some people from Myth, as well as the illustrious Ryan Landry. So make sure to check that out. A lot of great articles and upcoming content there as well.
Well, great. We'll have to have you on again. So thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And until next time, stay respected.